panel here today. We're going to talk about some RWAs. Just to start off, can you guys introduce yourself, the firm you're with, and how it touches RWAs?
Sure, I'll start. I'm Calidora, co-founder of Ostium Labs. We are building the first perpetuals DEX for real-world assets, starting with commodities and Forex.
My name is Nicholas Kunkel. I'm the founder of Chronicle Protocol, and Chronicle is the data layer that connects RWAs to DeFi.
I'm David Schwed. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Halborn, and our role is securing RWA projects.
Hello, my name is Mason. I'm the founder of Tokensoft. We launch and distribute tokens, so over $1 billion's been raised through our platform. We've launched over 100 assets. We launched the first 2 SEC-registered RWAs in 2020. So we had a lot of fun doing that on the Ethereum mainnet and tradable and everything.
Awesome. So I want to start with a little bit of a state of the market. Sean Lepel had a really good grouping of institutions in a tweet thread and how they're interacting with crypto in general. But I'm curious, and David, maybe if you can start, how institutions are thinking about RWAs. Where are they today? Calidora, I know you have some thoughts as well.
Sure. I think it's important to understand that institutions by design are very risk averse. So while they're crypto curious and crypto friendly, I think a lot of the projects that they're doing doesn't necessarily match up with what they're really doing versus like what the PR of tokenization of assets and bonds and all that stuff. But we're really, in my opinion, what's going on behind the scenes, it's more about creating proof of concepts and really understanding the technology before they really enter into the market. So there's a lot of building and there's a lot of excitement and there's a lot of planning, but I don't think there's anything yet that I would say, at least in the US, that's gonna really shake up the RWA market in the next 6 to 12 months.
And David, you'd say they're building like in-house, they're trying things.
Yeah, correct. There's, for example, there could be projects on tokenization of bonds, but it might be on a, private permission chain. It's order for them just to understand and get to know and touch the technology.
Yeah, I had a bit of an aside. I love that thread that Sean had, and I think there's a similar thing going on with the overgeneralization of the term real-world assets. Maybe for context, Sean's thread is basically breaking down what it actually means to be an institution, that institutions are sort of referred to with this very broad brush, but there's a lot of different subsets of that, and I think we see the same thing in real-world assets. Right now, RWAs are sort of painted as a niche subset of crypto when real-world assets is sort of the entire rest of the financial system, from mortgage-backed securities to commodities, Forex, equities, and so forth. And I think the term would benefit from a similar breakdown and a little bit more granularity, the way we refer to it, so we can be more specific in how we address sort of each of the ways they interplay with crypto currently.
I think that's actually a very cognizant point, right? Real-world asset means something completely different, kind of depending on who you're talking to. If we look at, boots on the ground today, what is actually happening in RWA at scale, I think you have to look at MakerDAO. MakerDAO has extended around $3.5 billion of credit into essentially what is RWA treasury bills and treasury notes. And so in terms of like capital deployment, I would say that is probably like 90% of the market today.
In RWA.
And so from Chronicle, we as like the Oracle kind of protocol powering Maker, right? That is kind of where we're focusing, right? Is what value as kind of this data infrastructure layer can we provide in that context? And I think the value is quite clear. And it's going to be kind of, this is going to have ripple effects kind of as RWA expands its scope into, corporate debt, into other more structured products, which is on the creditor side where DeFi protocols are lending, trying to get exposure to real-world asset yields. They are crypto protocols. They have no visibility over what goes on in the meat space, right? And so whereas these protocols are usually used to lending secured, right, against crypto collateral, very frequently they're finding themselves in this context where they're really lending unsecured. And so oracles really are the ability for those DeFi protocols to finally kind of like peek into that black box, and so they feel comfortable again that they're actually lending secured and not just kind of like throwing money into the void, right? Lending unsecured.
So this is a I think typically when people hear the phrase oracle, they think about price feeds.
Sure.
And you're solving quite a different problem.
That's very true, right? In this case, it's not the price that's important, right? It is the almost like custody of assets, right? So the way typical real world asset is set up, right? You may have a custodian, you may have a broker, you may have some kind of auditor or a trustee. And essentially, individually, you don't want to trust any of the information that is reported by any of these actors, because they each kind of have moral hazard, at least with respect to the perspective of the creditor, right, the DeFi protocol. But if you can phase match all of and aggregate all of this information, right, you can give a highly confident view to the DeFi protocol and report that, these assets, they exist, right?
Don't trust one, require verification from all.
Exactly. So it's don't trust, verify.
Mason, do you have any thoughts on besides for oracles, what might be some of the most important primitives or pieces that need to be built for RWAs to proliferate on-chain?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of experimentation in the RWA space today. I think the most important thing to build for the long term and to make sure these have integrity 10 years from now is to build into the regulations directly. So I think what are the primitives that can map into all the regulations that are out there, and to while allowing the assets to be DeFi compatible so they can plug into any of the protocols that are out there. So one thing that we had to build to get this through the SEC was we created something called ERC 1404, and that was sort of one of the primitives that we used to help the asset stay in compliance with the SEC regulations, but also globally. This was a primitive that was able to map into different jurisdictions as well. So it's pretty compatible. So that's one of the things that I think are necessary. The other thing is RWAs kind of require different security. So if you do build it into the regulations, we're used to the concept of custody. It's also important to administer these assets securely as well. And so that's sort of like a new, different concept that only pertains to RWAs. So for example, if it's a US Treasury-backed coin, as new treasuries are added to custody, new coins have to be minted. So how do you do that securely? If you need to freeze an asset to investigate, how do you do that securely? So I think that's another one of the primitives that needs to exist to do it, to have the space sort of follow regulations. So there's a few things like that, and I hope the space sort of makes those standard and is able to make those best practices.
So I do want to double click on the security thing, but I want to ask you about there's a token standard that you guys built, because I think standardizing permissions and requirements for off-chain assets would be a really important standard so that any off-chain asset can be traded permissionlessly. Can you tell us about the standard that you guys created and kind of what its requirements were?
Yeah, so for these assets to follow the regulations, the way we built ERC 1404 was, for example, before you could hold the token, you have to go through an investor onboarding procedure. And that's basically an onboarding procedure that helps the issuer comply with the regulations that it's operating under. And so we had a mechanism for onboarding. Once the investor's onboarded, their address is added sort of to a whitelist. These could be the same for all jurisdictions, or they could be different for different jurisdictions. So it's possible to have a US-only list. Anyone that's on this US list can now trade openly. Could plug into different protocols and stuff as well for the US persons. And any unauthorized transactions are basically rejected by that protocol. So If you're not on the list, you try to send. Sorry, if you are on the list, you try to send someone that's not on the list. Basically, transaction is rejected on chain automatically.
Was this not to? I think it's super interesting. Did you build this like in conjunction with any regulatory agencies or anything like that, or this is just you thought a really good idea?
Yeah, so to learn that we had to do this, we actually moved our company into the SEC building in San Francisco in 2018.
Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer.
Well, I wanted to make sure I was doing things right, so we started inviting over for coffee, doing tech talks for different groups internally at the SEC, and we basically figured out what the right architecture was for custody for this protocol, and basically for the whole stack of tooling that would map into the regulations as they are today. And so it was kind of a weird way that we figured it out, but we figured it out.
Wine and dine 'em. Did you want to say anything on primitives?
Just on infrastructure, I guess quickly I would just say I think we're more interested in the infrastructure that's required to make it easier and more seamless for consumers to trade these assets. And the primary thing that we think about is, or at least that I would say I am concerned about, or I think is the primary impediment to wider onboarding just generally within crypto, or onto DeFi specifically. I think about a lot about like account abstraction and sort of wallet tools that enable people to sign in. There are a couple examples like Privy, for instance, or 0xPass. They were in our cohort and alliance working on this stuff that I think is pretty exciting, but still a long way for the space to go. Reducing the friction basically to self-custodial, having your own wallet and trading directly with the DeFi protocol.
I love that answer. I think one of the big takeaways from like this conference is that apps are moving from, once you find product market fit as kind of an infrastructure piece, you have to win the consumer and the UX part. So I think that's something that no one's really focusing on, and I agree needs to be won.
I would say last thing on that, DEX users are necessarily still a subset of centralized exchange users, and a DEX for a very specific use case like real-world assets, it's also necessarily going to be a subset of existing DEX users. In order to solve that problem, the TAM of traders out there is much larger than the subset of the subset. Necessarily, the onboarding needs to improve. Otherwise, centralized exchanges will keep capturing people because people go through, a centralized exchange to get into crypto as opposed to sort of direct-to-wallet integration.
David, for institutions who are issuing or onboarding off-chain assets on-chain, it's a whole new world of security if you lose your keys or if you get hacked. Are enterprises thinking about this? What are solutions they're working on? Who could they call?
It's a great question. I think by design, like I was mentioning before, banks are typically risk averse. But when you start talking about Web3, this is for them, it's a new and emerging technology, and they don't necessarily have the talent pool in-house to really fully understand and grasp this technology. So there is a big reliance on vendors. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of the vendors in this space aren't necessarily at a mature stage in order to service these banks. So banks are at an unfortunate position to either have to lower their standards to work with certain firms, or they're going to go out and try to start building things on their own while also not truly understanding the technology. I think it's like kind of somewhat of a recipe for disaster in some respect. Now with this return to office mandate as well, they're really unable to hire and retain the talent that is needed in order to build these things. So it's unfortunate that the banks are the ones with the budget and the influence in the market, but yet they're really missing the mark as far as being able to build the technology, being able to understand, to really work with the vendors that they should be working with. So I think it's like I said, it's unfortunate, but I do see a shift as far as the vendors that are in the market today. As they're maturing, they really are focusing on things like their control environment and building an environment where they're getting their SOC 2 attestations or ISO certifications. So they're really understanding that they want to play in the enterprise space and what does it take in order to play the enterprise space. So I am seeing a maturity in the space from the vendors, and then I am also seeing the crypto curious and the crypto friendly banks really taking on a lot to try to understand the space from an educational perspective as well. So I am hopeful that they're going to, at the higher level, the enterprise space, really truly understand the technologies that they need and want to implement, as well as the vendors that they need to work with, maturing.
Terrific. I want to ask you guys for a little bit of a thought experiment about adoption for RWA. Everyone thinks big, especially with real-world assets. It's a huge category that we don't treat with a lot of nuance. My question is if we should be thinking small here if RWAs as a local experiment, places where they don't have deep liquidity or access to markets, is where we should be trying to find solutions versus winning global standards. So should we be thinking smaller and more local to win, to take advantage of the benefits of the permissionlessness of crypto? If anyone has thoughts.
I mean, I think it's quite the contrary, actually, right? The entire structuring around tokenizing securities is quite expensive, and we essentially had this problem at MakerDAO years ago, where we wanted to dip our toes in the water and do all of these kind of proof of concepts and pilot projects in terms of, out of our total balance sheet of 10 billion, let's allocate 20 million, 30 million, 40 million. But the cost to actually execute on this, both from the issuer side and even from the creditor side, is so expensive that it really doesn't make sense to do any of this for anything less than like 9 figures, right? And so
why is it so expensive?
I mean, one is anytime you're doing anything with securities, there's an enormous amount of regulation and red tape, right? In terms of the different types of entities that you need to interact with, that all need to have certain standards and certification. So that part certainly makes it quite expensive. But even on the creditor side, right, you have the reporting and monitoring of something that is like very bespoke, right? There's no standard rule book for how a DeFi protocol should monitor like its real world asset position, right? And it's not really a technology problem. Like DeFi protocols are not really any better at the human side of monitoring and analyzing risk than say like some kind of Wall Street institution. And so ultimately all of these costs add up significantly, and so you really get back to this where like, okay, at $100 million, at $500 million, at $1 billion, it makes a lot of sense. At $50 million, at $25 million, it does not. And so, using Maker as an example, right, what you've really seen over the past year has been consolidation, right? Really getting out of those kind of like smaller proof of concept experiments and really just funneling big money into the winners.
Anyone want to take the other side or no?
I have maybe an unconventional answer or analogy. You asked a question about basically global versus local and whether we should be focusing on sort of the larger or smaller. I'm actually more interested in thinking about global versus local from a virtual perspective rather than a meat space perspective. I don't know if anyone here recently listened to the most recent Balaji podcast on Moment of Zen, but he had an interesting framing, which was basically the frame sort of the gray tribe, which is the tech tribe, and talking a little bit more about like virtual proximity or intellectual proximity on the internet rather than physical proximity, in the sense that you could live next to your neighbor in your building and have very, very different beliefs about the world and sort of reference points, whereas there could be someone halfway across the world with follows the same people on Twitter or X, thinks about similar things. And so I think I'm actually more interested in especially from a user perspective, given that we're more of a consumer application, thinking about targeting users that are local or from a very sort of narrow set of types of people, but in the virtual space rather than in the physical space. So virtual local rather than meat space local.
I like that. Digital communities, the power users. Nice. All right. Similar concept. Do any of you guys target users who are already in existing regions or areas that have strong capital markets, or do you think ones that lack these kind of solutions are a better place to pitch?
I think there's I'm going to sort of answer your question, but maybe it'll provide good color. So I think there's a disconnect between what is going to make like something take off in the space, and I think the problem with real world RWAs is that what's interesting to traditional markets and has had success traditionally is not going to be what takes off, I think personally, in the next bull market. And the reason is a lot of things that take off in the crypto space happen really organically, and they happen because there's some narrative that's taking off, and so they sort of get caught up in that narrative and get some good pickup. And I don't think it's going to be traditional things that take off in the crypto space, but I think it's going to be something new, different, innovative that someone figures out that solves like an interesting problem. I'm kind of watching this maker stuff, and I do think that getting a mix of assets into there is interesting. I'm curious about whether it'll work long term, because I think I'm not seeing a robust regulatory structure being permeated in the RWA space yet, and I think that's what's going to give it a very strong foundational backing and remove a lot of question marks. But I think it's going to be something new and different, and I hope that when people work on bringing assets to market in terms of RWAs, they're sort of thinking of what's new, different, and innovative, and can fit into the crypto space in terms of narratives or what's actually interesting and cool to integrate.
There's an idea about birth versus rebirth of assets in RWAs. Birth being like crypto native assets, like hash-powered loans kind of thing, versus rebirth, which would be treasuries or mortgages bringing on chain. And you think it's much easier to proliferate things that are new and crypto native than to try to bring old ones on.
I'll take the opposing viewpoint. I think it's going to be a rebirth. I think when you start talking about traditional markets and capital markets, I think that you're talking about now two different things. Now you're talking about births of new investment vehicles or new different types of products with a new technology. I think it's something that they touch and they feel and that they're used to, and it's utilizing this new digital ledger technology. That's how they're looking at it. So if you look at something like out of Singapore, Project Guardian, where they're doing repo agreements on mainnet, they know repo agreements, repurchase agreements. They know how they function, they know how they work. Now it's taking this construct and putting it on the digital ledger technology to see how they can operationalize it and how they can create efficiencies. So I think personally, it's going to be more of a rebirth of existing products.
I just think, we didn't get cars by taking the horse and carriage and making the horse faster, giving him more legs. It was like completely different technology, new rails, and I really want to see some cool stuff that's different, I think, in the RWA space.
Great. Those are great perspectives. You have one?
My counterpoint to that would be, I think a better analogy, I like the car analogy, but maybe a better one is just looking at the first wave of digitization in markets. The main thing that changed was the technology and the sort of back end on where trades or where the market structure was occurring. That then can enable new types of derivatives or new types of trading instruments. But I think the first step is necessarily shifting an existing market structure and putting it on a different sort of base level technology, and that it acts as a springboard for something new. But
great perspectives. If you or for your clients could get a piece of clarity on any type of policy or regulation that would be most helpful to what you're building or they're building, do you have something at the top of the wish list?
I would like to see a real SEC registered broker-dealer custodian on the market, like a real one. And hopefully one of the big names out there is able to get one of those and support the space.
And that would solve on-off ramps and custodying assets.
It's the one major piece of the puzzle that hasn't been solved yet, even with Prometheum. And so I think that's something we should know what the rules are. I think it should be easy to get that license, and I think a lot of the incumbents in the custody space are well positioned with the right controls to take on that sort of responsibility.
Terrific. For the distributors or the on-off ramps, what's the pitch to them as like the 10x improvements? We know for users we need to win UX. What's the pitch for them as why having tokenized RWAs is a 10x improvement from their existing products?
It's really about efficiencies, right? You're talking about code that's running, that executes as designed. If you're talking about, again, like a repurchase agreement, as before, you're talking before about, paper. And if somebody breaches an agreement, now you have to take them to court and there's litigation. If you have everything wrapped up in a smart contract, there is no breach, because you can't breach because there's code that is operating between the agreements between the parties. So I think to me that's what it is.
I think, yeah, there's definitely less intermediaries, so it's like a more flat world in the RWA world, where it's users interacting directly with the issuers of the assets, and it takes out a bunch of intermediaries, which I think is super cool.
I think one thing I would add to that is there's sort of often you hear some people say blockchains are efficient or blockchains are inefficient. I would say from like getting many computers to agree is strictly more complicated than getting one computer to agree. So from that perspective, perhaps they're maybe more inefficient than a centralized backend. Where blockchains increase efficiencies in terms of getting rid of middlemen or logistical industries or areas where there's sort of a lot of logistics that increase in efficiency. So increase in efficiency from a logistics perspective, if not necessarily from a pure computational perspective, at least initially with the current infrastructure.
That's smart.
I would add to that the tokenization of a wide array of different types of securities and structured products. Once you tokenize something, you essentially have a wrapper around the essence of the thing that makes it uniform, right, to work with, right? And so it's not enough just to bring something on chain and be like, okay, now it's a real world asset, right? It's once it's on chain, it's what can we do with it, right? And as soon as we have this standard, we saw this with tokens, right? Everything was an ERC20 token, right? And the beauty of this was that you had a DeFi protocol, and as long as it supported ERC20, now it can support any token. I think we'd like the same thing with real world assets, right? Where we have some standard wrapper for bringing a security on chain that now, as long as you integrate the standard, you can interact with anything. And I think when we talk about efficiency, right, that's where, we get the efficiency gains. I think the other thing that blockchains have kind of proven over the past couple of years, if you look at DeFi Summer, is that they have this magical superpower of being able to accumulate liquidity extremely quickly through the use of incentives, right? So we saw during DeFi Summer, there would be some kind of food token, and it's not that the food token itself was innovative, but just by providing yield, they would be able to accumulate, $2 billion of TVL, essentially, right, the crypto version of AUM, right, $2 billion of liquidity in the span of like 24 to 48 hours, right? And I think that kind of capital formation is an extremely attractive reason for kind of bringing RWAs on chain, because I see that the future of liquidity is essentially just a globalized pool of super liquidity that exists on chain. And the reason for going on chain will be to tap into that global pool of liquidity.
I love that point. Is we were talking about earlier with the standardization. There's so much work going into RWAs and tokenization about getting them on chain, and nothing about what can you do with them once they're on chain. And a big problem with that is that with permissioned assets, you can't have permissionless liquidity unless you have some kind of standard and regulatory body and proof of whether you can trade it in what regions. So hopefully we can get some standards there and things trading. Guys, to wrap up, can you just share with how people can get in touch with you and anyone you're hoping to hear from, or what types of people you want to learn about?
I'm Calidora, my first name, across all platforms. I got lucky that I have that username everywhere, so you can reach out to me. And we are hiring devs, so if you're a Solidity dev, please reach out to me.
Cool. You can follow Chronicle Labs on Twitter, or go to our website, chroniclelabs.org. We'd love to connect with you. We are a next-generation Oracle platform, can serve all of your DeFi and real-world asset needs.
You can check us out at halborn.com if you want to connect with me. I'm Halborn Dave on Telegram. If you're regulated and can't use Telegram, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or just shoot me an email, first name, last name.
My name is Mason, tokensoft.com. You can find us on Twitter, Tokensoft Inc. My team always gives me a hard time because I shill myself and I don't shill the company Twitter. Tokensoft Inc. on Twitter. My Twitter's Masonic_tweets. But yeah, go to the website, fill out a form if you're looking to launch or distribute a token. Thank you.
I just made the same mistake. We are Ostium Labs on Twitter. Follow us.
Thank you, guys.